Hello and welcome to 2022. Why, yes, that was me out in the snow on January 1st, the first day of the year, bearing a piece of cloth out there under my pear tree. And I know it seems weird. Why would I have gone out in the snow to bury a piece of cloth? Well, it's part of a couple of projects that I've been working on that kind of merged together. I was invited to participate in something called the Buried Earth Book Project. And my plan is to bury one page of a book on the first of each month this year. And then I had the idea to combine that project with something else that I've been doing. I've been doing some exploration into ancestral cloth. I was born in Sri Lanka, and there are many different cloth and fabric traditions. And I thought that this was going to be a very simple, straightforward project. I would explore things like lace making and batik and a particular style of weaving that is associated with Sri Lanka. When I was thinking about the project, I thought since there's so many textile traditions that seem to revolve around cotton, that a good place to start would be learning to spin cotton. This is something that I've been wanting to do for a very long time, since sometime in the last century, when my weaving teacher gave me these little spindles, and she told me that they were supported spindles for spinning cotton. And they've been sitting in my studio waiting for me to do something with them ever since, for many years, over 20 years. And I finally had a chance to learn how to use them when I went to Guatemala on a weaving trip quite a few years ago. I think it was 2018. And then I came home and tried to use my spindles, and I failed terribly. And I tried several times, and I would give up in frustration each time. But this time, as part of the project, I was really determined to figure out how those spindles work. And I can spin wool fairly competently on a drop spindle, and I thought, how hard could it be to transfer the skills to cotton on a slightly different type of spindle? Well, it turns out it was quite complicated. But when I was learning to spin wool, I remember the teacher said, I absolutely could not do it by the end of the class, but the teacher said, if you go home and practice for 15 minutes a day, in 2 weeks you will know how to spin wool. So I did not believe her, but I thought, I can do that. So I went home, and yes, I did spend 15 minutes a day, and at the end of the 2 weeks I could spin wool. It wasn't great, but I was definitely better than I was after the end of that class. So I thought I would apply that same strategy to learning to spin cotton. And it was not easy. It was difficult. The instincts that I had for spinning wool and drafting, doing two-handed drafting with the wool fibers that really like to stick together, did not work with using a supported spindle and working one-handed. And I became quite frustrated, but was determined to come back the next day and try again. And surprise, surprise, I was not good the next day, but it was definitely easier than it had been the first day. And I came back and I did it over and over and over again, and I was able to spin cotton. Now, oh, and I forgot to talk about this. So it was part of my commitment to not buy any new materials and not even buy secondhand materials, to use things that I already have at home. I'm working with less than perfect tools. So you can see my spindles are handmade. It's just a skewer with a little blob of air dry clay at the bottom. And the cotton that I'm using is not ideal either. It's this stuff. This is quilt batting, cotton quilt batting. And it is the only sort of unspun cotton that I have in my house, and I have quite a bit of this. So I've been pulling this apart, teasing this apart, and using my hand carding tools to comb out the fibers so that I can spin with them. And this is meant to be sandwiched between fabrics, so I would imagine it's not the best quality cotton. I have really no idea what sort of staple lengths typical spinning cotton would have these days, but I'm sure it would be longer than this. But then, I'm kind of tracing back some ancestral practices. At least that's what I thought, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. And I didn't think that the cotton that would have been used many, many generations ago would necessarily have been bred to have a long staple length. So I felt like this would be an appropriate thing to use. Oh, and here's an interesting thing. So when I searched online for information about spinning cotton in Sri Lanka, I was really surprised at what I uncovered. It turns out that there is a document called the Mahavamsa, or in translation, the Great Chronicle, that is a record of the history of Sri Lanka from ancient times, the time of legend, up until the time that the entire island was surrendered to the British in the early 1800s. And one of the stories in this chronicle talks about the first humans to arrive in Sri Lanka. And they arrived in Sri Lanka on the exact day that the Buddha died in India. And when they arrived, they encountered a being called a Yakshini. Now, the Yakshini are spirits. The word can be translated as spirits, who are the keepers of the knowledge that's in the earth and in tree roots. And this Yakshini that they met was named Kuveni, and she was spinning cotton. So the piece of cloth that I buried under the tree amongst the tree roots has a piece of my hand-spun cotton stitched onto it in honor of Kuveni that was spinning cotton now. And here's the thing, I'm not sure that Kuveni was actually spinning cotton as we think of cotton today. So, and I don't think any of the people, the person who wrote the chronicle, who was a Buddhist monk, or any of the people who translated it into those multiple languages actually were textile people. And I think that perhaps they were using the word cotton as a generic term to refer to any thread or yarn. And the reason that I think that is, and I could be very wrong, I can't find any evidence of actual cotton plants growing in Sri Lanka. And here's what I think she may actually have been spinning. Well, not that plant. There's a plant called Sansevieria zelanica, which is native to Sri Lanka and southern India, and I will tell you about that in another video, because that also is an interesting story. So my process for spinning cotton was, I took the quilt batting and I pulled it apart, and then I combed it out using my hand carding tools here that I had in my house. And I know that none of my process here is considered good textile technique, but I don't think that matters, because I'm not really looking for a really precise technique. I'm just trying to get the job done. And then once I had combed out the fibers and that they seemed reasonably fluffy, I then wound them into what are called punies. Another word for a punie is a rolag. When these little coils of fluffy fleece are made out of wool, they're called rolags. But I understand that the word for a cotton little roll like this is a punie, which makes people laugh quite often. And then I took my punies and started spinning, and I have quite a few of these little hanks of cotton yarn now, and I know that they're lumpy and bumpy, and that's actually a good thing because I'm planning to use them to create the trunk of a tree. I have an idea in my head. I want to use some natural plant materials to dye these hanks into a variety of colors. We'll see what ends up happening. This is another little bit of an experimental process, and yeah, we'll see what happens, and I think that will also be another video. So stay tuned. There's much more coming. There's all kinds of twists and turns to the story here about my ancestral cloth investigations.